Night fell over the Kenya savanna, but it was not as quiet as it appeared. Between the whistling wind through the acacia trees and the rhythmic buzzing of insects, an out-of-place sound echoed, a faint, intermittent moan full of pain. Mark, a conservation expert with sun-drenched skin and hands crisscrossed with scars, held a flashlight scanning through the dry thorn bushes. The beam of light stopped in a natural deep hole, and his heart tightened. At the bottom of the pit was a tiny form, only the size of a house cat, with fur matted with mud and dried blood. That was Keto. Only a few hours earlier, his pride had been scattered after a brutal attack by poachers. Keto was the sole survivor, but the price paid was too great. He trembled, his amber eyes glassy and lacking the strength to even feel fear. When Mark jumped down into the pit and reached out his hand, the lion cub did not growl. He only staggered to lean his head against the palm of the man, seeking a final bit of warmth. Mark took off his thick canvas jacket, wrapped the small and chilling body of Keto, then pressed him against his chest. He felt the fast and panicked heartbeat of the little one under the layers of clothing. In that moment, amidst the murky darkness of Africa, a string of destiny was tightened. Mark whispered into the round ears of Keto,
"We've got you.
Do not be afraid, little boy. I am here. One day, I promise to bring you back to the position of a king, ruling this entire vast savanna." That promise was not just out of pity, but a vow that would change the lives of both for the next decade. 10 years at the Zangasan Sanctuary was a long journey where the boundary between wild instinct and human emotion was blurred. Keto was no longer the trembling little cat in the canvas jacket from years ago. Now, he was a powerful war machine with rolling muscles weighing more than 200 kilograms, a golden mane draping over solid shoulders like boulders. However, behind the appearance of a future king was a soul that seemingly never wanted to leave his human father. The life of Keto was established in a semi-wild area where a team of experts tried to maintain the most fragile balance. They taught Keto how to hunt through simulated models and challenging chases. Keto learned very quickly. He had the ability to hide in the dry golden grass perfectly and launch lightning strikes. Mark often stood from afar, observing through binoculars with pride mixed with anxiety. He saw Keto roar after each successful hunt, a majestic roar that made birds fly in terror away from the acacia trees. However, every time sunset fell, dyeing the Kenya sky red, the instinct of a lord gave way to the indulgence of a child. No matter where he was in the vast sanctuary, just hearing the sound of the old Jeep engine that Mark drove, Keto would immediately appear. He ran along the fence, emitting short and deep calls, the language that lions only use for members of their pride. Mark would stop the car and walk close to the dividing fence. Keto would lean his huge head against the steel mesh, waiting. It was the strangest moment. An adult lion with power that could take down any creature, yet closing his eyes, enjoying the gentle strokes of Mark on the exact spot behind the ear that he loved the most. Conflict began to arise as the day of freedom approached. Biological indicators showed that Keto was perfectly healthy, and his survival skills reached absolute scores. But psychologically, Mark noticed a frightening dependency. Keto did not connect with other lions in the vicinity. His gaze always searched for Mark among the crowd of conservation staff. The night before the release, Mark could not sleep. He sat outside the camp porch, looking toward the enclosure of Keto. This emotional bond was so deep, it was like an invisible cage. Mark wondered if he was being too selfish by nurturing such a great love, only for Keto to perhaps be lost in the cruel natural world now. He feared that, by giving Keto a family, he had accidentally deprived him of the solitude necessary to be a king. Could Keto survive when there was no one to stroke behind his ear every afternoon? That question kept lingering, heavy like the very night of the savannah. The morning of the release day, the savannah sky was a brilliant solid gold, beautiful enough to be heartbreaking, but carrying a heavy atmosphere that was hard to describe. The specialized transport vehicle stopped at the boundary of the open sanctuary, the place where after this strip of land, Keto would no longer have the protection of fences or prepared meals. Mark stood on the roof of the vehicle, his eyes red after a sleepless night. He knew this was the moment he had to fulfill the promise from 10 years ago. But his heart tightened as if someone was squeezing it. When the heavy iron cage door slid open, a silence covered the space. Keto slowly stepped out. The morning sun reflected on his golden fur, highlighting the majestic appearance of a true pride leader. He took a deep breath of the scent of wild grass, of the wind, and of the distant wild herds. But instead of rushing away like an arrow toward freedom, Keto suddenly stopped. He turned his head to look at Mark. 1 second, 2 seconds, then he lay flat on the scorched grass, emitting deep and heart-wrenching moans. That was not the roar of a king, but the cry of an abandoned child. Keto looked at Mark with a pleading gaze, then looked back at the familiar Jeep. During the next 60 minutes, a painful scene took place before the eyes of the conservation team. Keto did not leave. He just lingered within a few meters of the vehicle. Every time Mark intentionally reversed the car to encourage him to move forward, Keto would run after it, trying to bite the tires with his teeth as if wanting to hold onto the last link with the human world. Mark stood there, completely broken. He blamed himself for being so wrong. What have I done? He thought. I have turned a lion into a weakling who cannot live without human protection. He thought painfully that he had failed totally, that Keto had lost his wild instinct to choose a fake safety beside him. The sight of the king of the savannah lying prostrate at the feet of the vehicle, trembling and crying, was an insult to nature that Mark could not bear. The atmosphere became extremely tense. The conservation team began to discuss backup plans. They worried that if they left Keto in this unstable psychological state, he would soon become a target for hyena packs or other wild male lions lurking nearby. We must take him back, one expert spoke up. He is not ready. Leaving him here is just a death sentence. Mark nodded in hopelessness, his hand already touching the radio to order the preparation of the tranquilizer gun. There were only exactly 5 minutes left before they were forced to intervene, ending the hope of a free life for Keto. All hope seemed to have died out under the harsh sun of Kenya. Time passed like knife cuts into the heart of Mark. There were only exactly 5 minutes left before the rescue team performed the recapture. A staff member had already loaded the tranquilizer needle, his eyes full of regret directed toward Mark, waiting for a deciding nod. Keto still lay there, his head resting on the dusty ground next to the wheel, his amber eyes tearful, looking steadily at the man who had raised him. However, at the most desperate moment, a miraculous transformation occurred. Keto suddenly stood up. This time, he did not look at the vehicle or search for the hands of Mark anymore. He stood straight, his ears pointing toward the distant horizon, where the winds carried the scent of wildlife and the call of his kind. There was something deep within the instinct of Keto that had awakened. He realized that the love of Mark for him was not to keep him in his arms, but to prepare for this moment, the moment he must stand on his own feet. Keto took a deep breath, his muscular chest heaving. Then he let out a resounding roar. That was the most majestic roar that Mark had ever heard in 10 years. It was not a roar to threaten, nor a roar of hunting. It was a firm announcement sent to the vast savannah. The king has returned. That roar shook the space, making the birds in the nearby acacia trees take flight simultaneously, covering a corner of the sky. Right after the roar, Keto turned his head to look at Mark one last time. That gaze now no longer had pleading or weakness, but a deep gratitude and a sober farewell. Mark stood still, tears streaming down his cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. He understood everything. Keto was not afraid to go. He was not a coward. He had spent the past hour just to say goodbye. He needed time to process the pain of leaving his human father before stepping into a new life. That was an emotional intelligence far beyond what humans could imagine. The next action of Keto made everyone present hold their breath. He no longer hesitated, no longer lingered. Keto turned his back on the vehicle, taking strong and decisive strides toward the tall yellow burnt grass. The initial steps were a bit unsteady, as if getting used to the weight of freedom, but then he began to run. Kido rushed away like a golden lightning bolt, crossing mounds of earth, through thorn bushes, and then his great figure gradually vanished into the immense savanna of his ancestors. The promise of 10 years ago was finally fulfilled in the most heroic way. 1 year passed since the day the figure of Kido vanished into the mist of the savanna. Mark still continued his work at the sanctuary, but in his heart, he always reserved a quiet space to remember his boy. He had tried to suppress the intention to find Kido because he knew that human intervention at this time was the enemy of freedom. However, nature always has its own way to answer sincere hearts. One late afternoon, while checking long-range camera data placed at a strategic rock outcrop more than 30 kilometers from the sanctuary, Mark suddenly stopped. On the computer screen appeared a scene that made him choke up. Amidst the sunset as red as blood, a majestic male lion was standing tall on the high rock peak. That was Kido. His appearance now was completely different, weathered, mature, and carrying the full aura of a warrior. On his shoulders were long scars that had healed, the marks of fierce survival battles to protect territory. However, what moved Mark the most was not the strength of Kido, but what was happening around him. Behind Kido, a lioness and 3 lion cubs were leisurely walking out from a rock cave. Kido was no longer a lonely individual. He had built a family of his own, becoming a true king with a pride to protect and lead. He no longer needed the hands of Mark for warmth or prepared meals. Kido truly belonged to this place, to the eternal cycle of nature. In a magical moment, the camera captured the scene of Kido standing still on the rock ledge, directing his gaze toward the distant old conservation station. He stood there for a long time, his nose twitching to scent the air as if trying to find a familiar old smell. Perhaps, in the deep memory of that king, there still remained the image of a warm canvas jacket and a voice whispering in the dark night. 3 seconds passed. Kido looked directly into the camera lens with a deep gaze. Then he let out a light, short roar, the sound of reassurance, before turning his back to walk with his family into the darkness of the great wilderness. Mark smiled, a contented smile along with happy tears. He realized that the biggest lesson Kido taught him was not how to save a life, but how to let go. Loving a wild creature, or anyone we cherish, is not keeping them beside us to soothe our own loneliness, but giving them enough strength and belief so they can live most brilliantly even without us around. The success of love, sometimes, is a complete farewell. Kido had become king, and Mark had also finished the mission of father. Freedom, after all, was the most expensive gift they had given each other.